Hello, this is Keith All, and today's tutorial is a continuation on how pivot tables work in Excel 2016. And we're going to continue our discussion about the pivot tables areas. Again, the pivot table has 4 different areas: the rows area, values area, columns area, and filters area. We're going to talk today about the values area. Now, the values area displays the data or the values that we want to summarize in our pivot table report. So when you drag a field into the values area, the pivot table will then automatically sum or count the data in that field, depending on what the format of the data is. So for instance, if the data in the field contains numbers, then the sum of those numbers will be calculated. Now, if the data in the field contains text or blanks, the count will be calculated. Now, there are other calculation types that you can change later, and some of them are you can calculate the average or the max or the minimum of a certain value. Now, within the values area, you'll see on the next slide, the revenue field will be placed in the values area. And this field contains numbers, in this case, which is the sales dollars. And the pivot table will automatically sum the revenue for each region that is listed in the rows area. Now, as you can see here, to the left is our data source, or a snippet of that data source. This middle section here is our pivot table that was generated by us taking these fields up here and placing them in their respective areas. Now, this little pivot table tells us that we want to get data or sum the revenue per region. So we take the region field and we place it in the rows area down here. And the revenue field is going to be placed in the values area down here. And remember, since this data field or this data in this data source is formatted as numbers, so it's automatically going to sum those values up for us. So again, numeric data is automatically summed when you add it to the values area of the pivot table. So now what happens when we add a field to the values area? Well, it filters and calculates the data from the data source for each cell in the values area. Again, this is the snippet of the pivot table, and we want to summarize the total sales per region. So it goes to the data source and filters, it finds all the values for the Northeast region, and then calculates or sums up all those values. Now, how did a pivot table then calculate this number? Well, we can break it out in 2 different steps. First, the pivot table filters the source data for the criteria in the fields, columns, and rows area. Now, in this case, we only have one field in the rows area, which is region. So the region column in the source data is then filtered for the Northeast region. And you'll see that on the next slide. It actually calculates or filters data for all the regions, but we're going to use the Northeast region as a sample. Now next, the pivot table then calculates the sum of the revenue column. And that's why we place the revenue field into the values column. Now let's go to the next slide and see how this works. Now this entire process of filtering and calculating is then repeated for each cell in the values area of the pivot table. The region column is basically filtered for each of the 4 regions, and the sum of the revenue is then calculated and placed in the values area after each filter. So in other words, the pivot table, once we place the region in the rows area and the revenue column in the values area, it goes out to the source data, it filters all the regions one by one, and it retrieves all the values, in this case for the Northeast region, and it sums it up, and it places it over into the sum of revenue column here in the pivot table. Again, it does that for each unique region. So I hope this video today was very helpful for you to understand further about how pivot tables work, and specifically working with the values area in the pivot table. And again, as always, you can always navigate to my YouTube channel using this URL specifically for tutorials on Excel pivot tables and dashboards. Again, I want to thank you for stopping by today. I'll continue on this tutorial series on how pivot table works, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great evening. Bye now.